What really happened to Jesus 2,000 years ago? The Christian faith is based on the New Testament account, but some historians and theologians have very different, very controversial theories, with some scenes that may disturb you. Did Jesus die?
The most celebrated human being in history was a first-century Jewish revolutionary called Jesus. To his followers, he was the Son of God, with miraculous powers to walk on water, heal the sick, and even bring people back from the dead. According to them, he gave his life to save mankind. He was crucified and died. But on the third day, he rose from the dead and ascended into heaven. But throughout history, people have responded differently to this story. There have been those so inspired by the crucifixion that they wanted to share the experience. But there have also been those who denied the resurrection and have themselves been executed for their beliefs. There have been heresies that suggest that Jesus was rescued from crucifixion and escaped to lead a secret life in southern France. And there have even been people convinced that Jesus survived and traveled to the mountain kingdoms of Kashmir, where he died at the age of 80. To try and solve this 2,000-year-old mystery, some of the most devout Christians and most expert scholars will suggest new ways of reading the Gospels and ask the question, did Jesus die on the cross? Jesus Christ was executed because he was a fundamentalist Jewish agitator in a country only precariously occupied by the Roman Empire. But he inspired a religion that has spread across the whole globe. He did this partly through his teaching and through his life and death. But most of all, he became the inspiration for millions because his followers believed that he had risen from the dead. Christianity is based upon the resurrection of Christ and upon the concept of the gospel truth. To question one is to question the other. Throughout history, the Church has treated these questions as heresy and persecuted those who asked them. But 2,000 years after the events, many modern scholars and theologians, and even some who are training for the priesthood, now seem to doubt the historical accuracy of the Gospels, and even the literal truth of the idea that Jesus rose from the dead.
I've never been able to find a real dichotomy myself between being a good historian and a good theologian, or a good historian and a Christian, to put it very bluntly. I do not believe that gods and goddesses or anyone ever comes down from heaven and produces divine babies. I don't believe it actually happens. Nor do I think that Jesus, in a literal sense, went up to heaven to take his place at the right hand of God.
But how has it happened that so many Christian theologians have managed to interpret the Bible in ways that would once have been seen as heretical? The most obvious reasons can actually be found in the original text themselves, in the four Gospels.
I think all the gospel stories or the gospel accounts, they're something that's handed to us from childhood, really. So as we're sitting in our primary schools, we're told that it was Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, and they were four apostles, and Jesus did this and Jesus did that, and we see the pictures. And to a certain extent, we're not encouraged to question beyond that. It's presented as a narrative. It's presented as a storyline that actually happened. And I think for a lot of people, their belief never goes further than that. They simply remember these stories, and that's what happened. And I think the problem is, for individuals, when you start moving beyond that and try to work out what exactly the Gospels are.
One story on which they are all clear, concise, and more or less agree is the story of the crucifixion.
This is the Gospel of the Lord.
Every year at Easter, Christians in the Philippines reenact the crucifixion of Jesus as described in the Gospels. They actually volunteer to be crucified. They do it because they believe it will help them to purge their sins. For the onlookers, it's a bloody and brutal reminder of what happened to Jesus 2,000 years ago.
Crucifixion was the most cruel and atrocious punishment that the Romans could inflict. And it was inflicted only for treason and only on slaves. If you were a nobleman and you were a traitor, then normally you were strangled, something much simpler and much easier and much less painful. After condemnation, the cross beam, was strapped to the shoulders of the criminal, and he paraded through the streets with his arms stretched out. At the place of execution, then, nails were hammered into the hands and the feet.
In the Philippines, they use real nails. They do experience the real pain that Jesus felt. In fact, a man nailed to the cross does not die from his wounds. He dies, surprisingly, from suffocation. Hanging just by your arms from a cross, your chest is compressed. It's hard to breathe without supporting your body weight on your legs. Over time, the strain on the legs and the pain make that impossible, and you are unable to breathe. In the Philippines, the volunteers are brought down from their crosses within an hour. Death from crucifixion takes much longer, often several days. The only way to hasten death on the cross was to break the legs, making it immediately impossible to support your weight, and therefore to breathe. But the Gospels are all agreed that Jesus died after only 3 to 6 hours. The crucifixion began at the 3rd hour.
And it was the 3rd hour, and they crucified him.
Some think that the Gospel according to Luke has the shortest crucifixion.
It was about the 6th hour, and when Jesus had cried out with a loud voice, he gave up the ghost.
Matthew and Mark clearly have Jesus surviving a little longer.
And about the 9th hour, Jesus cried out.
The disciples wanted to take Jesus' body down from the cross immediately, but the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate, was doubtful.
And Pilate marveled if he were already dead.
Pilate was reassured by the centurion that Jesus was dead. But this was the same centurion who had earlier said,
"Truly, this man was the Son of God."
Jesus' body was then laid in a tomb donated by a rich man, Joseph of Arimathea. This Joseph and a man called Nicodemus came to minister to the body.
They came to Jesus by night and brought a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 100 pounds weight.
These accounts, when viewed as an historical rather than a sacred record, may raise many questions. Why did Jesus die so quickly? Why did Joseph and Nicodemus take so many herbs into the tomb? But no one really doubts that Jesus was crucified.
You read the story of the empty tomb, and on Friday someone is killed, and on Sunday they're gone from the tomb, and you ask the question, what might have happened? Either God raised him from the dead, which is the traditional Christian affirmation, or the body was carried away by someone, body stolen. And those two possibilities are even talked about in the New Testament.
According to Matthew, the Jews who were hostile to Jesus' followers claimed that his disciples had stolen his body out of the grave and then pretended he was resurrected.
While the enemies of Christians immediately came up with conspiracy theories to explain the resurrection, the stories told by the Gospels are very down-to-earth. They describe how Jesus was alive again. He ate, he drank, and Thomas could touch his wounds. It's therefore perhaps not surprising that people who have always looked for natural explanations of miracles have suggested that Jesus was alive because he didn't die on the cross.
There are many versions of that story. One came up in a book years ago called The Passover Plot, which suggested that he had been sedated on the cross, that he was removed quite early, and therefore could well have survived. That's certainly a possibility.
The disciples did manage to give Jesus some kind of substance on a sponge.
They filled a sponge with vinegar and put it upon hyssop and put it to his mouth.
And Jesus immediately died after taking this substance.
When Jesus had received the vinegar, he said, "It is finished."
But oddly enough, it isn't necessary to suggest that Jesus was sedated or drugged by whatever was on the sponge in order to believe that he could have survived. There are stories of people who did survive crucifixion. The Jewish historian Josephus wrote of one of his own friends surviving crucifixion in Palestine in the 1st century.
He's traveling out to a village named Tekoa to scout land for a Roman camp. And he notices that 3 of his friends are hanging on crosses. So he requests that they be allowed to, that they be brought down. And Titus, the Roman general, gives him permission. The 3 are brought down immediately and given medical care. And 2 of them died, but the 3rd survived.
So is it possible that Jesus could somehow have survived? Certainly he was speedily executed, perhaps too speedily.
When you look at the story of Jesus and how he was executed by the Romans, he's on the cross for 6 hours. The assumption is that he's dead. The Roman soldiers check the body. There were 2 others crucified according to the gospel accounts, and they broke the legs of those to hasten their death because the Sabbath day was coming. When they came to Jesus, they said he's already dead. Presumably, his body's motionless, he's quit breathing. They then prepare the body and put him in a tomb, and presumably it's sealed up, and he's dead for all practical purposes. The question, though, is he clinically dead?
The question of clinical death is certainly raised by the fact that the herbs Joseph of Arimathea took into the tomb with the body of Jesus were aloes. These are healing, not embalming herbs. So could it be that Jesus was resuscitated in the tomb?
A lot of modern people, I think, confuse the term resurrection with life after death. Resurrection is a Hebrew idea, and it's the notion that someone is in the world of the dead, which the Hebrews call Sheol, and they have their body's been buried, and they resuscitate, or they come back. A term we might use today would be resuscitation more than resurrection. It would actually get the idea. We do have stories, both from the modern world and from the ancient world, where people appear to be dead, and for all practical purposes they are dead. That is, they're not responding to the outside world, but then they do, in fact, revive or come back. We call it resuscitation, but if you want to press the language, that would be resurrection.
Whatever actually happened, the different gospel stories do all agree that the disciples saw Jesus as if he were alive. But if Jesus survived, it doesn't necessarily mean that the resurrection was a hoax or a deliberate falsehood. At the end of the 19th century, the English writer Samuel Butler, in his book on the resurrection, came up with the theory that if Jesus had collapsed in a shock-induced coma on the cross and then recovered, he and the disciples would actually have believed his recovery was a miraculous resurrection.
That still has great credibility if you see it in the light, for instance, of more contemporary developments. Look at the near-death experience in the United States. Something like 13 million people in the United States say they've had near-death experiences. They've seen this white light. They believe it to be some form of miracle. So the idea that in the 1st century, when they had none of this scientific insight and they had none of these hospitals or whatever to save them, that people thought it, actually makes a lot of sense. It doesn't make them fraudsters or shysters. It actually makes them genuine people who thought they'd witnessed a miracle.
Whatever the circumstances, if Jesus was alive, then he and his disciples face a serious problem.
If Jesus was placed in the tomb and somehow was revived, he himself would certainly think that was an act of the grace of God. I came right to the bars of death and was brought back. But now there's a practical problem. It's a political problem, actually. Romans basically do one thing to messiahs. They crucify them.